All right. Merry Christmas, everybody. I was really hoping to do this today, and I'll admit things aren't perfect in terms of this setup. I'm just taking a minute here to make sure that the quality settings are where they need to be, and then I'll be able to set up properly. And then this will probably wind up on YouTube, so I know people get really cranky when things aren't what they expect. So I am going to be reading Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and I hope you all enjoy this. But one of the catches is that this is a live broadcast, and unfortunately, my reading on its own isn't maybe that great. But on top of that, I am going to be stumbling over a few words, and if I cough, if I need to, take a break or anything like that, it's live. There's no way of correcting it. So please keep in mind this is probably going to be an imperfect rendition of the story, which is a really wonderful story. And it's obviously there are more professionally done things than what's here, but I do also want to share it with some folks, especially for those of you who, especially during at a period of lockdowns, may not necessarily have anything else going on during Christmas. So feel free to chat. I will be a little bit less responsive to chat for obvious reasons, but I will have it up, and the alerts and all of that will be active, but they will not be making sound. So everything's going to be pretty quiet except for me. I'm just going to take a quick sip of a warm beverage. And I should give credit where credit is due. So there is, for those, I think most of you know of this, but there's a project called Project Gutenberg, which has a nice repository of works that are in the public domain. This is a more complicated issue than people might think, because there is a difference between copyright in Canada and the US being probably where my primary audience is. And a really good example of this would be reading the works of George Orwell, which would be fine in Canada, but I believe is actually still under copyright in the United States. So the good news is that the original of A Christmas Carol was back in 1843. It is actually the life of the author that matters, but Charles Dickens has not been with us for a while. So Olaf, thank you for that host. I won't be responding to so many things once I get going on the story, but yeah, so I am going to be reading the text from Project Gutenberg, and it's a really nice source if you're looking for something to read and for one reason or another don't have access to a library. You can find a lot of really good stuff in that. All right, let's do this. A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas by Charles Dickens, with illustrations by John Leech. Preface. I have endeavored in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea which shall not put my readers out of humor with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant, C.D. December 1843. I should mention that this is broken up into 5 staves, so I may wind up taking a couple of breaks in between the staves. So, Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything that he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know, of my own knowledge, that there is a particularly dead... Mind, I don't mean to say that I know, of my own knowledge, what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat, emphatically, that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners, for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and his sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he had an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come from the story I am about to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood years afterwards above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm known as Scrooge and Marley. Some people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out a generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped at his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows and wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and he didn't thaw at 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of no advantage over him could boast of the advantage over him in one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind man's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then they would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, Dark Master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, and what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, in all the good days of the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, a bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warn them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting-house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. He couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with a shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being of a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation that he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so seated himself with a rapid walking in fog and dust, the nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow, his face ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason do you have to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason do you have to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready at the spur of the moment, said "Bah!" again, and followed it up with "Humbug." "Don't be cross, uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in a world with fools such as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon a Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in it through and round a dozen months presented dead against you? If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with a Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." "Uncle," pleaded the nephew. "Nephew," returned the uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine." Keep it, repeated Scrooge's uncle. "But you don't keep it." "Let me leave it, then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, but which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind and forgiving and charitable and pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open up their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on their own journeys. And therefore, uncle, although it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire, and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and I'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder if you don't go into Parliament. Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did, and he went the whole length of the expression, and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" cried Scrooge's uncle. "Why?" "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love?" growled Scrooge, as if it was the only thing in the world more ridiculous than Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing from you. Why can we not be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I'm sorry, with all my heart, to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I will keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and a family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. Certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head. He handed the credentials back. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly in the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." "Are there no prisons?" said Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say that they were not." The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then, said Scrooge. Both very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid, from what you'd said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it. Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer in mind and body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink, and means of warmth. We chose this time because it is a time for all others when want is keenly felt, and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. You wish to remain anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, this is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. But you might know it, observed the gentleman. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business, and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself, and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses and carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds, with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street, the corner of the court, some laborers were repairing gas pipes, and had lighted a great fire in the brazier. Round with a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug, left in solitude, its overflowing sullenly congealed, had turned into misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops the brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers' and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as the Lord Mayor's household should, and even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and baby sallied out to buy beef. Foggier yet and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good St. Dunstan had nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of, "God bless ye, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized a ruler with such energy that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and an even more congenial frost. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expected clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out. I'm sorry. At the length of hour of shutting up the counting, at the length of the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I were to stop a half-crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'd be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to his chin. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no great coat, went down a slide on Cornhill, and at the end of the lane boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blind Man's Bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building-up yard, where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying that it must have been run there when it was a young house playing hide-and-seek with other houses and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost hung about the black old gateway of the house, that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker of the door, except that it was very large. It was also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had little of what they called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, alderman, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner at that afternoon. And let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any immediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley had used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on his ghostly forehead. His hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid color made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of its face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomena, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which he had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he had put his hand upon the key that he had relinquished, turned it steadily, and walked in and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he had half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out of into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, and so he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded throughout the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have several peal of echoes on its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs, or through a bad young act of Parliament, but I mean to say that you might have got a hearse up that staircase and taken it broadwise, with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easily. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought that he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in that gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out in the street wouldn't have lighted up the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut the heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was all right. He had just enough recollection of that face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel, Serge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door. He locked himself in. Double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the at least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abrahams, Balthazars, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like an ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been blank at first with the power to shape some picture on the surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. "Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. He threw his head back in the chair. His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in his room, and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that, as he looked, he saw the bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang loudly, and so did every other bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door, and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" and fell again. Sorry, there are illustrations in this book. There we go. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, his usual waistcoat, tights, boots, the tassels on his the latter bristling like his pigtail and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons of the coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked like the phantom through and through, and saw it standing before him, he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound to its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "Hush now," said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost, being so transparent, might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of it being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if he was quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his own terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit staring at those fixed, glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though this ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven. "You see this toothpick," said Scrooge, returning quietly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You're not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, "notwithstanding." "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and for the rest of my days be persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" As the spirit raised a frightful cry, it shook its chain with such dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling into a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage around its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hand before his face. "Mercy," he said, "dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, and woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, in trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full and heavy, and as long as this 7 eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other minister to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting-house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. "You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed, in a business-like manner, though with humility and deference. "Slow," the ghost repeated. 7 years dead," mused Scrooge, "and traveling all the time." "The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse." "You travel fast?" said Scrooge. "On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost. "You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked his chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for nuisance. "O captive bound and double-ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in this little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that was no space of regret that I can make amends for one's life of opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I." "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hand again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." It held up its chain at arm's length, as if it were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. At the time of the rolling year... sorry, I gotta take a drink. "At this time of the rolling year," the spirit said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise man to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light could have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me!" cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge. "But don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob. Pray. How is it that How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his bow. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." "You are always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank you." "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded, in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us." When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it around its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chin wound over about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge, and floated out upon the bleak dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity, and he looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was, clearly, as they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and they had lost that power forever. Ah, curses. Whether these creatures faded into the mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but he stopped at the first syllable. And being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse into the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. That's the end of Stave 1. I do need to take a second to drink, and I do see there's a lot of you, so thank you very much for stopping by, and thank you for the hosts, Olaf and Ariella. I'm not going to interrupt the Staves too much for commentary, but I couldn't get the bot to give that... I couldn't get the bot to give the announcement there, so I appreciate your patience at not seeing replies. Stave 2, the first of 3 spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters, so he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, and then stopped. 12! It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten into the works. 12! He touched the spring of his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12, and stopped. "Why, it isn't possible," said Scrooge, "that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything happened to the sun. This is 12 at noon." The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with a sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and he could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there was unquestionably would have been if night had been beaten off by bright day. If night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after the sight of this first exchange, pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge of this order and so forth would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again, and thought it over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself after mature inquiry that it was a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in state until the chime had gone 3 quarters more, when he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he more than once convinced that he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. "Ding dong! A quarter past," said Scrooge, counting. "Ding dong! Half past," said Scrooge. "Ding dong! A quarter to it," said Scrooge. "Ding dong! The hour itself," said Scrooge triumphantly, "and nothing else." He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room in the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand, not the curtains at his feet, not the curtains at its back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, staring up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with an unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I am to you, and am now standing in the spirit... and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was as white as with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle on it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of this wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all of this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now in another, and what was light in one instance and at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, now being a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now with a pair of legs, without a head, without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would itself be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge could not yet have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. "What!" exclaimed the ghost. Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?" Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend, or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life, and then made so bold as to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. "Rise, and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm, and that the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing-gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, could not be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made toward the windows, clasped his robe in supplication. "I'm mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch on my hand there," said the spirit, laying upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished, not a vestige of what was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold, wintry day, and snow was upon the ground. "Good heaven," said Scrooge, clasping his hands together, and he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared to still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered with an unusual catching in his voice that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it!" cried Scrooge with fervor. "I could walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate, every post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, its winding river. Some shaggy ponies were now seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All the boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were full of merry music, that crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are but shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The jocund travellers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why, he was rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them. Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he had heard them give each other a Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas, what good had it ever done to him? "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof, and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach-houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthy savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them, and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the panelling, not a drip from the half-thawed water-spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not an idle swinging of an empty storehouse door, no, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence to give a freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to this younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in his belt, and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, I know. One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come, for the first time, just like that. Poor boy. And Valentine," said Scrooge. "And his wild brother, Orson. There they go. And that's his name who is put down in his drawers, asleep, at the gate of Damascus. Don't you see him? And there's the Sultan's groom, turned upside down by the genie. There he is upon his head. Serve him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?" To hear Scrooge expanding in all earnestness of this nature on such subjects, in a most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city indeed. "And there's the parrot," cried Scrooge. "Green body and yellow tail, with a thing like lettuce growing out of the top of his head. There he is! Poor Robinson Crusoe, he called him. And when he came home after sailing round the island, poor Robinson Crusoe, where have you been, Robin Crusoe? And then he thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for his life to a little creek. Hello, hoop, hello!" And then the rapidity of transition, very foreign to his usual character, he said, in a pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and he cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with a cuff, "but it's too late now." "What's the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved his hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct and that everything had happened so. And there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with the mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms around his neck and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother. "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan," returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimful with glee. "Home for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. That home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more that you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man," said the child, opening her eyes, "and never to come back here. But first we're to be together all Christmas long and have the merriest time in the world." "You are quite a woman, little Fan," exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there," and in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension, and threw into him a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlour that ever was seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he would rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by the time tied up on the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, with quick wheels dashing the hoarfrost and snow from the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. "Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost, "but she had a large heart." "So she had," cried Scrooge. "You're right. I will not gainsay it, spirit, God forbid." "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, I think, children." "One child," Scrooge returned. "True," said the ghost. "Your nephew." Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, "Yes." Although they had but a moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of the city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops, and here too it was Christmas time again, but it was evening and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it," said Scrooge. "I was apprenticed here." They went in. At the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk as if it had been 2 inches taller than he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and he cried out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there! Ebenezer! Dick!" Scrooge, his former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. "Dick Williams, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, yes. There he is. He's very much attached to me, he was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve. Dick, Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up," cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands, "before a man can say Jack Robinson." You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, and had 'em up in their places. 4, 5, 6, barred 'em and pinned 'em, 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. "Hilly-ho!" cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. "Clear away, my lads. Let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho! Dick, cheer up. There's Ebenezer." Clear away. There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off, as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, the fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright as a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they all broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proved to have her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again, all the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again, and soon they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When the result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" and the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest, upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, as though there were no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on the shutter, and he were a brand new man, resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, there were more forfeits, there were more dances, there was cake, there was negus, there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it to him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood there out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them, 3 or 4 or 20 pairs of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have had been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher, and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would have become of them next. And then old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread and needle, and back again to your place. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his wet legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 7, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took to their stations, one on either side of the door, shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, with the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, with the light upon its head burnt very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small," echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the 2 apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, "Why, is it not? He spent but a few pounds of mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much as he deserves that praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not the latter self. "It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add up and count them. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What's the matter?" asked the ghost. Nothing particular, said Scrooge. Something, I think, the ghost insisted. No, said Scrooge. No, I should like to be able to say a word or two with my clerk just now, that's all. His former self turned down the lamps as he gave an utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost, once again, stood side by side in the open air. My time grows short, observed the spirit. Quick. This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone who he could see, but it produced an immediate effect, for again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but he'd begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. It matters little, she said softly. To you very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve. What idol has displaced you? He rejoined. A golden one. This is the even-hand dealing of the world, he said. There's nothing on which is so hard as poverty, and there's nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth. You fear the world too much, she answered gently. All your other hopes have been merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? He retorted. Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you. She shook her head. Am I? Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man. I was a boy, he said impatiently. Your own feeling tells you that you were not what you are, she returned. I am. That which promised happiness when we were of one in heart is fraught with misery, now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you. Have I ever sought release? In words? No, never. In what then? In changed nature, in altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end, and everything that made my love of any worth or value to you in sight. If this had never been between us, said the girl, looking mildly but with steadiness upon him, tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now? Ah, no. He seemed to yield to the justice of this supposition in spite of himself, but he said with a struggle, You think not. I would gladly think otherwise if I could, she answered. Heaven knows, when I have learned of the truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can I even believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? You, who in your very confidence with her, weigh everything by gain? Or choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to be your one guiding principle to do so, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you, with a full heart, for the love of him you once were. He was about to speak, but her head turned from him. She resumed. You may, the memory of what is past makes me hope that you will, have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it, gladly, as an unprofitable dream, from which it had happened that you woke. May you be happy in the life that you have chosen. She left them, and they parted. Spirit, said Scrooge, show me no more, conduct me no more. Why do you delight to torture me? One shadow more, exclaimed the ghost. No more, cried Scrooge. No more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more. But the relentless ghost pointed him in both arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place, a room not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Nearer to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so that, alas, that Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there was more children there than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count. And, unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, there were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, But every child was conducting itself like 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief. But no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much. And the laughter, soon beginning to mingle in the sports, got pillaged by the young brigands most ruthlessly. What would I have not given to be one of them? Though I could never have been so rude. No, no. I wouldn't for all the wealth of the world have crushed that braided hair or torn it down, and for the precious little shoe I wouldn't have plucked it off, God bless my soul, to save my life. As to measuring her waist in sport, as they did, bold young brood, I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to have grown round it for a punishment, and never to have come straight again. And yet I should have dearly liked, I own, to have touched her lips, to have questioned her, that she might have opened them, to have looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes, and never raised a blush, to let loose the waves of hair, an inch of which would have been a keepsake beyond price. In short, I should have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and yet to have been man enough to know its value. But now knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she, with laughing face and plundered dress, was borne towards the center of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet their father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling and the onslaught that was made on the defenseless porter, scalping him with chairs for ladders, and to dive into his pockets, to spoil him of brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hug him around his neck, pommel his back, and kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight with the development of every package was received. The terrible announcement that the baby had been taken in act of putting a doll's frying pan into its mouth, and was more than suspected of having swallowed this fictitious turkey glued on a wooden platter. The immediate relief of finding this a false alarm, the joy and gratitude and ecstasy, they were all indiscernible alike. It is enough that by degrees the children and their emotions got out of the parlor, and by one stair at a time to the top of the house, where they went to bed, and so subsided. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother by his own fireside, and he thought that another creature quite as graceful and as full of promise might have called him father, and had been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life. His sight grew very dim indeed. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon." "Who was it?" "Guess." "How can I? I don't know," she said in the same breath, laughing as she laughed. "Mr. Scrooge." Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and it was not shut up, and he had a candle inside. I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone, quite alone in the world, I do believe. "Spirit," said the Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these shadows are things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face, in which some strange way there were fragments of all of the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it. "Leave me! Take me back! Haunt me no longer!" In the struggle, if it can be called a struggle, in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting with its influence over him. He seized the extinguisher cap, and by sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, and so that extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed it down with all force, he could not hide the light, which streamed from under it, in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of it being extinguished, and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and he had barely had time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. So that is Stave 2. I'm going to take a quick second to refill my water and get a drink. If you have any comments or that, feel free to put them in chat. But there is going to be a brief pause before I do the next section, just so I can refill. Thanks, everyone. I know the reading isn't ideal, so I appreciate the encouragement. All right. Stave 3, the second of the three spirits. Awakening in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness right in the nick of time for an especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he had turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains the new Spectre would draw back, he put every one of them aside with his own hands, and laying down again established a sharp lookout around the bed, for he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, are usually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1, and no shape appeared, he was taken by a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, and yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed up on it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or what it would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at the very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I might have thought at first, for it is always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of the ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. The idea of taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called to him by his name and bade him enter, and he obeyed. In his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were hung with living green, that it looked perfectly grove from every part which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there. Such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney, as the dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many a winter season gone. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joins of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon the couch there lay a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in a shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up high to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping around the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in, and know me better, man!" Scrooge entered timidly, and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he was not the dogged Scrooge that he had been, and through the spirit's eyes, though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I'm the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe, or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, sat there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free, free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and its ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You have never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made an answer to it. "Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers, born in these later years?" pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I'm afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1,800," said the ghost. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. "Spirit," Scrooge said significantly, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music in the scraping of snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the tops of their houses, whence it was a mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of the snow upon the roofs. And it was dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been plowed up in deep furrows on the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows and crossed and recrossed another hundreds of times where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, the shortest streets were choked up with dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad in that clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, a better-natured missile far than many worldly jest, laughing heartily as it went right, not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiteers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts shaped like waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples clustered high in booming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from the conspicuous hooks, that people's mouths might water gratis if they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk baffins, squat and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set among these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant-blooded race, appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went grasping round and round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. The grocers, nearly closed, with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1. But those gaps, such glimpses! It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down by juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar to make the loudest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it the figs that were moist and pulpy, or the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their high decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat in its Christmas dress, But the customers were all so hurried and eager in the promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other on the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of little like mistakes in the best humor possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh with the polished hearts they were fastened upon their aprons might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection, and for Christmas daws to peck at if they chose. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flooding through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces. And at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, nameless turnings, innumerable people, carrying their dinners to bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge behind him in a baker's doorway, taking off the cover as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other and shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was, God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners and progress from their cooking in the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if the stones were cooking too. Is there a peculiar flavor in which you sprinkle from your torch? Asked Scrooge. There is, my own. Would you apply it to any kind of dinner on this day? Asked Scrooge. To any kindly given, to a poor one most. Why to a poor one most? Asked Scrooge. Because it needs it most. Spirit, said Scrooge after a moment's thought, I wonder you, of all beings in the many worlds around us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment. I, cried the spirit. You would deprive them of their own means of dining every seventh day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all, said Scrooge. Wouldn't you? Aye, cried the spirit. You seek to close those places on the seventh day, said Scrooge, and it comes to the same thing. I seek, exclaimed the spirit. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family, said Scrooge. There is some upon this earth as yours, returned the spirit, who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they have never lived. Remember that, and change their doings on themselves, not us. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible, as if they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully as a supernatural creature, as if it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went, and there he took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with a sprinkling of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Sundays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out, but poorly, in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and made a goodly show for a sixpence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into a saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt-collar, Bob's private property conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they'd smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in the luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced around the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked out loudly in the saucepan to be let out and peeled. What has ever got your precious father, then? Said Mrs. Cratchit. And your brother, Tiny Tim, And Martha wasn't as late as Christmas Day by half an hour. "Here's Martha, mother," said the girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the two young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha!" "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her officious zeal. "We'd a great deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind, so long as you've come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye." "Oh, no, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide." So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob with the father, and with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive from the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. "Not coming on Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you'd ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made the lame beggars walk and blind men to see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother, sister, to his stool before the fire, and while Bob, turning his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it around and round, and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensured that you might have thought the goose was the rarest of all birds. It was a feathered phenomenon to which the black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like that in this house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at a table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their post crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they shriek for the goose before it was their turn to be helped. At last the dishes went on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly along the carving knife, preparing to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, even from Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat upon the table with the handle of his knife, and thereby feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe that there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, that they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion and to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have gone over the wall in the backyard and stolen it while they were merry to the goose. A supposition which had the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were to be supposed. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper, a smell like washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating-house and a pastry-cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's door next to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a specked cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half of a half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck to the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Cratchit said, and calmly, too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said now that the weight was off her mind, she would confess that she had her doubts as to the quality of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been a flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound and the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. And all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to all of us, my dears. God bless us." To which the family re-echoed, "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon the little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest that he never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in a poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he'd better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man be you in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide that what men shall live and what men shall die? If it may be, then that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, hear the insect of the leaf pronouncing too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes before the ground. But he raised them speedily, hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I'd hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know who he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health, and for your sake, then the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was after the first of their proceedings, which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge and the baleful being, After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at the milliner's, then told them the kind of work that she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning to get a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter. when Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head as if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were very far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, that inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with time, and when they faded, they looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. By the time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, as Scrooge and the Spirit went along in the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze slowed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates breaking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be shut out by the cold and darkness. Ready to be drawn to shut out the cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and to be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, all chanting at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbor's house where, woe upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches, well they knew it in a glow. But if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was home to give them welcome when they had got there, instead of every house expecting company and piling its fires half a chimney high. Blessings upon it, how the ghost exulted, how it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before, doting the dusky street with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the Spirit passed, though little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and dark desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, and though it were the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west of the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, and was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What is this place?" said Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of earth," returned the Spirit. "But they know me. See." A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through a wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled around a glowing fire. An old man and an old woman and their children, an old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The Spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge to hold his robe, and passing on above the moor sped whither? Not to see. To see. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed, the wild year through, there had been a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind, one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed. But even here 2 men who watched the light had made fire, that through the loophole in some thick stone wall laid out a ray of brightness on the awful sea, joining their horny hands over the rough table on which they sat, and wished each other a Merry Christmas with their can of grog. And one of them, the elder too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on, until, being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood behind the helmsman at the wheel, and look out at the bow. The officers had made watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on the day than on any day in the year, and shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as profound. Let me try that again. Sorry. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it was his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with Spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. Laughed Scrooge's nephew. It should soon happen, by an unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in laugh than Scrooge's nephew. All I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate the acquaintance. It is fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that when there is infection and disease and sorrow, when there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides and rolling his head and twisting his face to the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily. He said that Christmas was humbug, as I live, cried Scrooge's nephew. He believed it too. More the shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless those women. They never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in a little creature's head. Although she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I'm sure he's very rich, Fred, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least you always tell me so. What of that, my dear? Said Scrooge's nephew. His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. He doesn't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he's ever going to benefit the U.S. with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters, and all the other ladies, expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried, who suffers by his ill will himself always. Here he takes into his head to dislike us, and he won't come to dine with us. What's the consequence? He doesn't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert on the table, were clustered around the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye on one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast, and that he had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereas Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clasping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister had tried to do so with aromatic vinegar. His example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas until he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I define him if he finds me going on there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so they laughed at any rate. He encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family, and they knew what they were about. They sung of a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away the bass like a good one, and never swell the veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among the other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When the strain of music sounded, all the things that the ghost had showed him came upon his mind, and he softened more and more. He thought that he could have listened to it often, years ago. He might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they don't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There was first a game at Blind Man's Bluff. Of course there was. And I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas past knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage to the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping went he, but he always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you'd fallen up against him, and some of them did, on purpose he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sided you off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when in spite of her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, and his conduct was the most execrable, for his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and to further reassure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger, and a certain chain about her neck. It was vile and monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it, when another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's bluff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. She joined in the forfeits, and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, with the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting, in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears, and sometimes came out with his guessed quite loud, and often guessed quite right too, for the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel warranted not to cut his eye. He was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in the head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed, but the spirit said that this could not be done. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest had to find out what it was, he only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of. And it wasn't led by anybody, and it didn't live in a menagerie, and it was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I found it out! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment. though some objected to the reply that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as the answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts away from Mr. Scrooge, supposing that they ever had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink to his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready in our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is," said Uncle Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but he may have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return and thanked them for their in an inaudible speech, if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again in their travels. Much they saw and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit took beside sick beds where they were cheerful on foreign lands, and they were close at home by struggling men when they were patient in their greater hope, by poverty, and it was rich, in almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain men, in a little brief authority, had not been made fast the door, and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had doubts of this, because Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time that they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left the children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that his hair was gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life on this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near." For chimes were ringing at 11:15 at the moment. "Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of the robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, and miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look here! Look down here!" exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate, too, in their humility, where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with their freshest tints. A stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade, though all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge stared back appalled, having them shown to him in this way, and tried to say that they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down on them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. The boy is ignorance, the girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware the boy, for on his brow I see that it is written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it," cried the spirit, stretching out its hands towards the city. "Slander those who tell ye. Admit it for your facetious purpose, and make it worse, and bide the end." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes behind a solemn phantom draped and hooded coming, like a mist in the ground, towards him. All right, I'm going to take another short break, and we will move on to the 4th stave. Thank you for the comments. I'll be back in a little bit. All right, thank you for your patience. Stave 4, The Last of the Spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and misery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of the visible save an outstretched hand. For this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come?" said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed outward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us," Scrooge pursued. "Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head, and that was the only answer that he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for it. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes fixed intently on him, while he, though he stretched back on his own to his utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre that I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company, and to do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge. "Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away as it came towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city seemed to spring up about them and encompass them in its own act. But there they were in the heart of it, on 'change amongst the merchants, who hurried up and down and clinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches, and tried thoughtfully with their great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed them, Scrooge advanced to listen to them talk. "Nope," said the great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it. Either way, I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first with a yawn. "Was he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence at the end of his nose, and shook like the gills of a turkey-cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with a large chin, yawning again. "Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for on my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer." "I don't mind if lunch is provided," observed the gentleman with the excrescence on his nose, "but I must be Fred if I make one." Another laugh. "Well, I am the most disinterested among you, after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves and I never eat lunch, but I'll offer to go if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not all that sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye." Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided into the street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking for the explanation might lie there. He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance, and he made a point of always standing well in their esteem. In a business point of view, that is. Strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first. "Old Scratch gone down to his own at last, eh?" "So I'm told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?" Nope, nope. Something else to think of. Good morning. Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was first inclined to be surprised that the spirit would attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial. But feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was the past, and the ghost's provenance was the future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom that could apply to them. But nothing doubting that whomsoever they applied, they had learned some latent moral for his own improvement, he resolved to treasure up every word that he had heard and everything that he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared, for he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue that he missed, and would render the solution to these riddles easily. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to the usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself through the multitudes that poured through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought that he had hoped that this newborn resolutions had carried out in this. Quiet and dark beside him stood the phantom, with its outstretched hand. When he roused himself from this thoughtful quest, he fancied, from this turn of the hand and its situation in reference to himself, that unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of town, where Scrooge had never penetrated before, though he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Arches and alleyways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offenses of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets. The whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth, and misery. Far in the den of this infamous resort there was a low-browed beetling shop, below a penthouse roof, where iron old rags, bottles, bones, greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse islands of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in the mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat, and sepulchres of bones. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in, by a charcoal stove made of old bricks, was a gray-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtaining of miscellaneous tatters hanging upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of a man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into his shop. But she'd scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. "Let the charwoman be the first," cried she who entered first. "Let the laundress alone be the second. Let the undertaker's man be alone to the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance. If we haven't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place," said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlor. You were made free of it long ago, you know. And the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. Ah, shrieks. There's a rusty bit of metal in the place of its own hinges, I believe. And I'm sure there's no old bones here as mine. We're all suitable to our calling. Well, we're well matched. Come into the parlor. Come into the parlor." The parlor was a space behind a screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stir-rod, having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, and put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle onto the floor and sat it down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees, looking with bold defiance at the other two. "What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so." "Why then, don't stand staring as if you were afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber and the man together. "We should hope not." "Very well, then," cried the woman. "That's enough. Who's worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose?" "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber, laughing. And if you wanted to keep him after he was dead, the wicked old screw, paused the woman, why, wasn't he a natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have given somebody to look after them when he was struck with death instead of lying gasping out the last there alone by himself. It's the truest word that ever we spoke, said Mrs. Dilber. It's a judgment on him. I wish it was a little heavier judgment, replied the woman. And it should have been, you may depend on it, if I could have laid my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, old Joe. Let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We know pretty well what you were helping ourselves, that we were helping ourselves before we met here. I believe it's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe. But the gallantry of her friends would not allow this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breech first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive, a seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked up the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them up to a total when he found that there was nothing more to come. That's your account, said Joe. I wouldn't give it another sixpence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next? Miss Dilber went next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. I always give too much to ladies. It's a weakness of mine. That's the way I ruin myself, said old Joe. That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock it off half a crown. And now undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman. Joe went down on his knees for greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of dark stuff. What do you call this? Said Joe. Bed curtains. Ah, returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on crossed arms. Bed curtains. You don't mean to say you took him down, rings and all, with him lying there, said Joe. Yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not? You were born to make your fortune, said Joe, and you'll certainly do it. Certainly shan't hold my hand when I get anything in it by reaching it out for the sake of a man such as he was, I promise you, Joe, returned the woman coolly. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now. His blankets, said Joe. Whose else do you think? Replied the woman. He isn't likely to take cold without him, I dare say. I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh? Said old Joe, stopping his work and looking up. Don't you be afraid of that, returned the woman. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter around him for such things if he did. Ah, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best that he had, and a fine one, too. I'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me. What do you call wasting of it? Asked old Joe. Putting him on to be buried, to be sure, replied the woman with a laugh. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming to the body, but he can't look uglier than he did in that one. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. They sat grouped around their spoil in the scantily light afforded by the old man's lamp. He viewed them with detestation and disgust, which could have been hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. Ha ha! Laughed the same woman when old Joe, producing a flannel bag with money in it, told out several of their gains upon the ground. This is the end of it, you see. He died frightened every one away from him was too alive to profit us when he was dead. Spirit, said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot. I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life ends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this? He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in an awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced down in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unkept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger on Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do so, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. Oh, cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command, for this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honored dead, thou canst not turn one hair on thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious. It is not it is not that the hand is heavy and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous and true, the heart brave, warm, and tender, and the pulse a man's. Strike, shadows, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound, to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice? Hard dealing? Griping cares? They have brought him to a rich end, truly. He lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, woman, or a child to say that he was kind to me in this or that, and for the memory of one kind word I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. So they wanted the room, what they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge dared not to think. Spirit, he said, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me. Let us go. Still, the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. I understand you, Scrooge returned, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power. Again it seemed to look upon him. If there is any person in this town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that person to me, Spirit. I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, with an anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, stared at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children at their play. And at length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly for what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed to answer. Is it good, she said, or bad? To help him. Bad, he answered. Are we quite ruined? No, there is hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, she said, amazed. There is nothing past hope, if such a miracle has happened. He is past relenting, said her husband. He's dead. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so, with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness in the next moment and was sorry, but the first was emotion of her heart. What the half-drunken woman who I told you of last night said to me, when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we're not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor and his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. Let me see some tenderness connected with a death, said Scrooge, or that dark chamber spirit we left just now will be forever present with me. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet as they went along. Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling that he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated around by the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before them. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set them in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out, and he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. "The color hurts my eyes," she said. "The color? Ah, poor Tiny Tim." "They're better now again," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight. I wouldn't show my weak eyes to your father, but when he comes home, for the world. It must be near his time." "Past it, rather," Peter answered, shutting up the book. "But I think he's walked a little slower than he used to these past few evenings, Mother." They were very quiet again, and at last she said in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, I've known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed." "And so have I," cried Peter. "Often." "And so have I," exclaimed another. "So had all." "But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent on her work, "and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. There's your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter. He had need of it. Poor fellow, he came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him out the most. And then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid, and each child gave a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father. Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table, and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls, that they would be done long before Sunday, he said. "Sunday? You went today, then, Robert?" said his wife. "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you some good to see how green the place is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child," cried Bob. "My little child." He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been further apart than perhaps they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down on it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked. The girls and mother working still, Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day and seeing that he looked a little, just down, said Bob, inquired as to what happened to distress him. On which, said Bob, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you have ever heard, I told him, "I'm heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit," he said, "and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know." "Knew what, my dear?" "Why, that you were a good wife," replied Bob. "Everybody knows that," said Peter. "Very well observed, my boy," cried Bob. "I hope they do. Heartily sorry," he said, "for your good wife. If I can be of any service to you in any way," he said, giving me his card, "that's where I live. Pray, come to me." "Now it wasn't," cried Bob, "for the sake of anything that he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way that he was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt it with us." "I'm sure he's a good soul," said Mrs. Cratchit. "You would be surer of it, my dear," returned Bob, "if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised. Mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation." "Only hear that, Peter," said Mrs. Cratchit. "And then," cried one of the girls, "Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself." "Get along with you," retorted Peter, grinning. "It's just as likely as not," said Bob. "One of these days, though, there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure that none of us will forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we, or his first parting that was there among us?" "Never, father," they cried all. "And I know," said Bob, "I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it." "No, never, father," they all cried again. "I'm very happy," said little Bob. "I'm very happy." Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, and the daughters kissed him, and the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter himself shook hands. "Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God." "Spectre," said Scrooge, "something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man was whom we saw lying dead." The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, though at a different time. He thought, indeed, there seemed no order in these latter visions, save that they were in the future, into the resorts of businessmen, but showed him not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on, as to the end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. "This court," said Scrooge, "through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for some length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in days to come." The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere. "The house is yonder," Scrooge exclaimed. "Why do you point away?" The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same. The figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined it once again, and wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanying it until they reached an iron gate, he paused to look around before entering. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose names he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite. A worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it trembling, the phantom exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw a new meaning in its solemn shape. "Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only?" Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. "Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if preserved in, they must lead," said Scrooge. "But if the course is to be departed from, the ends will change. Say it thus with what you show me." The spirit was as immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "Am I the man who lay upon the bed?" he cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him, and back again. "No, spirit, no!" The finger was still there. "Spirit!" he cried, tight clutching at the robe. "Hear me, I'm not the man I was. I will not be the man that I was. I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I'm past all hope?" For the first time the hand appeared to shake. "Good spirit," he pursued, as if down on the ground he fell before it, "your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I may yet change these shadows that you've shown me by an altered life." The kind hand trembled. "I will honor Christmas in my heart. I will try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, in the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me that I must sponge away the writing on this stone." In his agony, he caught the spectral hand. If it sought to free him itself, but he was strong in his entreaty. He detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into the bedpost. Stave 5. The end of it. Yes, the bedpost was all his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. "I will live in the past and the present and the future," Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed. "I will live in the past and the present and the future," Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed. "The spirits of all three will strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and Christmas thine be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Jacob, on my knees." He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice could scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. "They are not torn down," cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arm. "They're not torn down, rings and all. They're here. I'm here. The shadows of things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will." His hands were busy with his garments all the time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making no parties to every kind of extravagance. I don't know what to do, cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath, and making a perfect Laocoon of himself with his stockings. I am as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm giddy as a drunken man. And a Merry Christmas to everybody, and a Happy New Year to all the world. Hello there! Whoop! Hello! He had frisked into the sitting room, and he was now standing there, perfectly winded. There's a saucepan that the gruel was in, cried Scrooge, staring off again and getting round the fireplace. There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley had entered. There's the corner where the ghost of Christmas Present sat. There's the window there, and I saw the wandering spirit. It's all right. It's all true. It happened. Really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh, a most illustrious laugh, the father of a long, long line of brilliant laughs. I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know how long I'd been around the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm a baby. Never mind. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hello! Hello there! He was checked in as transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clash, clang, hammer, ding-dong-dell, bing-dong-ding, hammer, clang, clash. Oh, glorious, glorious! Running to the window, he opened it, and he put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold, pining for the blood to dance to, golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious! What's today? Cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes who had perhaps loitered in to look about him. Huh? Returned the boy, his might all wonder. What is today, my fine fellow? Asked Scrooge. Today? Replied the boy. Why, it's Christmas Day. It's Christmas Day, Scrooge said to himself. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello, returned the boy. Do you know the poulterers next to the street, but one at the corner? Scrooge inquired. I should hope I did, replied the lad. An intelligent boy, said Scrooge. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one. The one as big as me, returned the boy. What a delightful boy, said Scrooge. It's a pleasure to talk with him. Yes, my buck. It's hanging there now, replied the boy. Is it? Said Scrooge. Go and buy it. What? Huh? Explained the boy. No, said Scrooge. I'm in earnest. Go and buy it, and tell him to bring it here, that I may give you the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at the trigger who could have got a shot off that fast. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's will be. The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did. Somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man, and he stood there, waiting for his arrival. The knocker caught his eye. I shall love it as long as I live, cried Scrooge, patting it with his hand. I scarcely ever looked at it before. What an honest expression it has in its face. It's a wonderful knocker. Here's the turkey. Hello! How are you? Merry Christmas! It was a turkey. He could never have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped him short off in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax. It's impossible to carry that to Camden Town, said Scrooge. You must have a cab. With a chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, which were only exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again, and chuckled until he cried. Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much, and shaving requires attention, even when you don't dance while you're at it. But if he had cut the end of his nose off, he would have put a piece of sticking plaster over it, and he would have been quite satisfied. He dressed himself in all his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people, by this time, were pouring forth as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas Present. Walking along with hands behind him, Scrooge regarded every one with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that all the blithe sounds that he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far, when coming on towards him, he beheld a portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. It sent a pang across his heart to think about how this old gentleman who looked upon him when they met, but he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it. "My dear sir," Scrooge said, quickening his pace, taking the old gentleman by both of his hands, "how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you, and Merry Christmas to you, sir." "Mr. Scrooge?" "Yes," said Scrooge. "That is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon. And will you have the goodness—" Here, Scrooge whispered in his ear. "Lord bless me!" cried the gentleman, as if his breath were taken away. "My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?" "If you please," said Scrooge. "Not a farthing less, and a great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor?" "My dear sir," said the other, shaking hands with him, "I don't know what to say to such munificent—" "Don't say anything, please," retorted Scrooge. "Come and see me. Will you come and see me?" "I will," cried the old gentleman, and it was clear that he meant to do it. "Thank you," said Scrooge. "I am obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you." He went to church and walked about the streets and watched people hurrying to and fro and patted children on the head and questioned beggars who looked down into the kitchens of houses and up to the windows and found everything that could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and he did it. "Is your master home, my dear?" said Scrooge to the girl. "Nice girl. Very." "Yes, sir." "Where is he, my love?" said Scrooge. "He's in the dining room, sir, along with his mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please." "Thank ye. He knows me," said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining room lock. "I'll go in here, my dear." He turned it gently and sidled his face in round the door. They were looking at the table, which was spread out in great array, for these young housekeepers, always nervous on such points, like to see everything is right. "Fred," said Scrooge. Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started! Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her sitting in the corner with the footstool, or he wouldn't have done it on any account. "Why, bless my soul!" cried Fred. "Who's that?" "It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" "Let him in. It is a mercy that he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did the plump sister when she came. And so did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late, that was the thing that he had set his heart upon. And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. He was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come into the tank. His hat was off before he opened the door. His comforter, too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake the 9 o'clock. "Hello," growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming in here at this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir," said Bob. "I am behind my time." "You are?" repeated Scrooge. "Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please." "It's only once a year, sir," pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank. "It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "Now, I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge. "I'm not going to stand this sort of thing any longer, and therefore," he continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again, "and therefore I'm about to raise your salary." Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling to the people in the court for help with a straight waistcoat. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge, with an earnestness that could not be mistaken. He clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, and I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. Bob, I make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good of a friend and as good of a master, and as good of a man, and as good as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset, and knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, He thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins and have the melody in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with the spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possess the knowledge, may that be truly said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. And that is the end of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. So I apologize for stumbling over the words and the different dialogue. I'm really, really happy that all of you stuck through with it. I really like that tattoo idea, by the way, Gavinator. And thank you very much for the bits. Miss Ariella, thank you very much for the host, as well as Olaf. I definitely saw you, Night Valiant and Valiant Cheese and Olaf. Well, sorry, I mentioned Olaf already. And Carlo, hello. Sorry if you're coming in at the end. But yeah, thank you all. This was definitely a bit of an experiment, and it's a wonderful story, isn't it, Gavinator? I know for those of you, some of you will probably be watching this on YouTube, and if you came through the end, you probably don't necessarily want to hear conversation, but it is just chatting, and I figure we can all, we can all do a little bit more. But did anybody hear this story for the first time out of curiosity? Thank you very much for gifting that sub, Olaf. I guess I can turn the audio back on if we want. I'm happy to sit around and chat for a little bit if that catches people's fancy. But yeah, I don't know if people are already familiar with this story, or if this is kind of preaching to the converted. I know Gavinator. I mean, maybe it's not a surprise that you like the story, Gavinator. It's a really good one though. So you've not read it, you've heard passages and you've seen adaptation, but you haven't heard it in full. Read it a few times, but not recently. Yeah, one of the things that's tricky, and if I ever do like a proper recording of this, there is a lot of really good humor, and I'm not always sure what to do with some of the more clever lines. So a really good example of this is it's actually in Marley's Ghost. So there's the description of Marley, taking off the bandage that's holding his jaw in place, and it's like dropping of the it like drops down to his chest, and then there's the moment. I'm trying to find the exact Yeah, here we go. It's like one of my, I mean, this is actually one of my favorite lines in the book. It's no light part of my penance, pursued the ghost. I'm here tonight to warn you that you have a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You're always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank you, right? So, of course, you can see the really hopeful Scrooge and all of that. And the very next line is, you will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell about as low as the ghost's had done. There's actually a few lines on that one, and this is one of the things that I kind of need to work on as I do more, readings and recordings. There is one of me doing a modest proposal. There's one where you can really like goof it up, and I don't like doing that because it's sort of is insulting to the listener, who can probably pick up on the humor of the moment. But one of the drawbacks is that if I don't adjust the cadence of what I say, it's really easy to have something like that get missed, especially when some of the more tangled passages. I mean, I'm pretty sure Dickens was paid by the word for some of this stuff. I'm not quite yet that trained in my reading, so that, I don't have those stumbles, and it's sometimes a little bit hard to follow. So obviously it would be easier for me to read simpler books, but you want you to read an immodest proposal. But yeah, I mean, as long as most of it came through, I think this is one thing that's true of Shakespeare. Like, even if you're watching, like middle school students perform it, usually the charm of the writing tends to outdo any any imperfection of the performance, and I sincerely hope that I didn't do Dickens an injustice with with the work. Failing that, I was reading the Project Gutenberg version. That's also where the images came from. So I do encourage you. I mean, in terms of reading it out loud, that was done in under 3 hours. So it's certainly not a long read by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, sorry, I want to catch up a little bit with some of chat. So actually, I'm curious, Gavinator, have you ever read Swift's Modest Proposal? You're a big fan of it. Love the Patrick Stewart film version. I've not actually seen the Patrick Stewart one, but I know we talked about. Oh, this is a wonderful one. So this is a Modest Proposal is an essay where he proposes that the poverty of Ireland can be solved by eating babies. So I will happily send you a link either to the recording or to the reading of it. The one drawback is when I recorded it, I did not realize that there was an anti-Semitic bit inside of it. It's, it's one line, but the trick here is that to me, there's no such thing as lightly anti-Semitic. It's it's there. It's a stain on an otherwise brilliant piece of satire. And so, I'd planned to make that the first thing that I recorded. And I'm reading this thing for recording and I'm like, God damn it, John. What's wrong with you? So, it's one of these things that I kind of have to clearly put in the disclaimer. Again, I think the work holds up despite it, but it's one of these things that's probably better we confront it on its own. So it's been a while since I've read A Christmas Carol, and I didn't remember anything too bad about it, but there was certainly a moment where I'm like, oh man, I hope there isn't anything that I regret inside of it. So, and yes, thank you, Olaf, for gifting the subs to Gavinator as well. So for those of you who don't always go on Twitch, for those of you who got the subs, that gives you access to these emotes, which you can access either through the little emote slot below, or you can use the text if you mouse over it. The Eyes of Sin did some wonderful work on these emotes, and it makes me very happy when I see you all use them. But yeah, I mean, again, I didn't want to focus too much on Jonathan Swift, but yeah, I would definitely say, especially given that you like A Christmas Carol, that you have a good sense of humor, and that issues of sort of poverty and inequality are sort of live issues and ones that you are interested in, beyond the old style of writing, which can sometimes be a little hard to follow when I read it out. It's probably why the text might be useful to have alongside. I definitely think it's a very good piece of satire, and I think it's a really good example of the genre. But yeah, sorry, I've moved a little bit past A Christmas Carol. I'll give you a link to the video when I'm done. But yeah, Valiant Cheese Olaf referenced the Muppets one. The Muppets one is definitely one of my favorites, and actually, having just read it, I think we can, you can kind of see one of the things I really like when Gonzo's playing the role of the narrator. Waldorf and Statler playing the Marley brothers in that case. The 1951. So I got to see the 1951 version, Gavinator, but I shared the reading with you, so now I'll watch the film as your contribution. But what I like about the Muppets one is it's so the digressions, I referred to this in an earlier stream, but the digressions that Gonzo goes on at the start, and it winds up with him being a bit of a dialogue with Rizzo the rat, and it just kind of seems like, okay, this is one of the fun things that maybe thus the Muppets do. But it's actually very true to the tone of the book, which goes into these long digressions about how the phrase is as dead as a doornail, but wouldn't a coffin nail be more appropriate? But, that's the wisdom of our ancestors says doornail, and I'm not going to be the one to, to contradict it. That's something that doesn't really work in film, but they were able to retain it by giving the Muppet that is the narrator the very same qualities. And I like that. I also generally like the fact when it comes to the end, right? Like Rizzo and Gonzo kind of vanish during the sequence with the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. And of course, during that segment, that Stave 4, there's not nearly as much editorial inside. There's not as much editorial inside. In fact, I mean, again, I was obviously focused on doing the stream, so I couldn't say this with certainty. But while there are references to I, the narrator, in some of the other staves, I don't actually think that's present. I think the narrator doesn't ever refer to themselves in that particular stave. And instead it's, describing Scrooge does X, Ghost does X, this person says this. These are just sort of the things there. I think for me, like, these are the markers of like a really, really good adaptation, one that recognizes that film is its own form. And so it needs to be an adaptation, not a transposition. But it takes the text seriously enough that it includes the material where it can, just through other means. But yeah, so I will definitely watch the 1951 version, Gavinator. I'm so sorry to reduce the conversation to the films so quickly, because obviously it's a written work that we just enjoyed, but I'm just trying to think. I don't want to make the stream any longer than it needs to be. I'm happy to wrap things up if there's nothing else to talk about. Two great mistakes in the 1951. Okay, well, I definitely want to hear the two mistakes. But yeah, as I'm carrying on, once we wrap up the conversation about the film, have I ever watched Scrooge? No, I know of it. It's like Bill Murray's one. I would like to see it. But when I wanted to see it, I was little, and my parents said that it wasn't appropriate for small children. Like, it was even, I don't remember when that movie came out. Like, it was definitely an older movie, like when I wanted to see it, but apparently when I wanted to see it, to them, I was not old enough. So I want to make the stream as long as possible. Well, if I do, I should probably play something, but no, I haven't. It is one I'd like to see, though. And actually, ideally, it's one that I would like to see close to the, it's one that I would like to see close to, having read the book recently. Yeah. Well, like, another good example of this would be, one of Heath Ledger's breakout movies, 10 Things I Hate About You, which has, so like, I know a bunch of people who've seen that movie and they think that the movie's a bit obsessed with Shakespeare because there's so many references to Shakespeare. But of course, the reason why there are so many references to Shakespeare in it is because it's the Taming of the Shrew. So yeah, exactly. Like, that's, it's funny though, right? Because if you don't have the point of reference, but like, even then it's a great example where it's going to, that there's going to be a few different layers of meaning, and it works as a film. Like, this is the thing, like, there's a bunch of people who really like that movie who may not necessarily understand that it's an adaptation. But of course, if you do know about the adaptation, and particularly if you've read the play, then you kind of get that level of enjoyment, and hopefully you feel that the material's been dealt with right. I have a few Dickens books in my collection that I haven't actually read yet. Um, but I kind of want to read A Tale of Two Cities again. Yeah, Valiant. I mean, the difficulty with those references is that most of the times when filmmakers will include those, is it's going to be a reminder for how clever, like basically it's a big signpost for, how clever they are. So Martin Scorsese has many great qualities as a filmmaker, but he really, really falls into the habit of reminding you how clever, like basically how clever you are for noticing this big thing that he signposted. And of course, it's specifically intended to make you feel smart for noticing it. But when I watch it, it immediately pulls me out of the film. And this can be everything from like, some of his older movies. Well, I mean, they're all the ones I'm going to refer to are older movies, but like wrapping Daniel Day-Lewis up in the in the flag, literally wrapping him up in an American flag while he's giving a monologue, or having a rat run along a rail on a deck at the end of The Departed. Like, it totally doesn't need to be there. And I feel like there are stronger filmmakers with more confidence, both in the audience's intelligence and their ability, like, and their own ability to tell a good story, who don't need to do that stuff. That, I tend to gravitate more towards that sort of stuff. Like, that's the thing, Gavin. I've always kind of felt really worried about, like, there's a tendency of like picking up, like, so here's the one thing for me, like, I really enjoyed a lot of my literature classes, and like so I grew up in, actually, no, here's a perfect example, right? So sometimes this sort of stuff can become difficult, and there's some that age well, and there's some that don't age well. So, I had Sunday school as a kid, I'm reasonably familiar with the contents of the Bible. And one of the reasons why I think that's beneficial is because a lot of the Western canon has been written with an assumption that people are familiar with the Bible. The same way that if you read some ancient Greek works, it will kind of mention the Iliad without necessarily sort of saying, oh, hey, there's this bit in this book, the Iliad. It's just kind of taken for granted that this is something that people are familiar with. He's helping the hoi polloi. Yeah, well, this is just it, right? Like, there is a way that this sort of stuff can become very snobbish, and I don't necessarily want that. I think it always should be something that just enhances the enjoyment of something, as opposed to just sort of every time it just sort of becomes a moment where somebody says, hey, look at me. But one of the things is that, of course, when you're writing something or when you're filming something, there are things that you can take for granted and they will carry on over time. And then there are other times when they don't age very well. So I'm just trying to find the section in the book right now. It's when he's talking with his nephew. I've got the nephew bit up here. Here we go. So this is just after the nephew's kind of given his speech. So the clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded, becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety. He poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. Let me hear another sound from you, said Scrooge, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir. So, one thing I could have done better in the reading is distinguishing when he is talking to Bob and when he's speaking to his nephew. Quite a powerful speaker, sir, he added, turning to his nephew. I wonder if you don't go into Parliament. Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. So here's a line that probably confused a lot of people. Scrooge said that he would see him, yes, indeed he did. He went through the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. But why? Cried Scrooge's nephew. Why? This is probably really unclear to a modern audience. But basically the line, what Scrooge says is to his nephew, as far as my reading of it is, he says he'd sooner see him in hell, basically. But I'm assuming that for I think this was published in a paper before. I'm assuming that's kind of the the Dickens era equivalent of like a juice dropper. So like there's certain things that you don't mention over breakfast television. But clearly here, just like if you read Paradise Lost, but you've never read the Bible, some of the material's not going to be familiar. In this particular case here, I suspect to a certain extent we're a little bit familiar with coarse terms. So maybe we're wondering why the statement doesn't need to be said in its, in full. But on the other hand, too, it's just, I don't think we tend to say, I'll sooner see you in hell in most of these cases. My wife did theater and drama, and every time she something goes over your head, she says, "How did you not see X and Y? It was right there." Well, for what it's worth, Gavinator, like I feel the same way in a lot of stuff that I read and a lot of movies that I watch. But the good news is, like everybody comes with their own experiences, and stuff speaks to people their own way. So I'll give you two film examples, both James Cameron's films, and I know I've referred to these before. But so one thing, like I've seen Terminator way too many times. But one of the things I love about Terminator and the structure of Terminator is that before Sarah Connor and the Terminator ever meet, right? This happens at Tech Noir. There are multiple moments when technology betrays its owners, which is of course the whole theme of the film, right? Sarah Connor can literally never get a call through the entire movie until the Terminator is in her apartment, and then the answering machine betrays where she is. That is how it knows to find her in Tech Noir. Her roommate is listening to her headphones, has them on way too loud, and is completely unaware of the danger in the apartment with her. Like, if you watch that movie, there's a very consistent and persistent string of cases of technology betraying their masters. So we don't really use DVD drives anymore, but what I should have really been detecting, like whenever the DVD drive would close before I put the disc in, that's a sign the Terminator is coming. So the other one that I really like, again, another James Cameron film, is Titanic. And if you watch, the best way to first see this would be the scene where the captain sort of says, take her out to sea, let's stretch her legs. And, you see everybody in the boiler room, tossing the coal in, and the props like really go up. James Horner uses this sort of synthesized chorus. And, this big sweeping shot over the deck of the Titanic. And what's very common in that film is you're going to hear that synthesized choral sound every time in the ocean. And it's like that. Essentially, it is a sound that is associated with the ocean. You never, ever hear that instrument inside the Titanic until it starts sinking. And there's this really great moment where it's like the ship has already been sinking, but it's like the really big moment where it's about to sort of break in half, and like it's really the final time where if anybody's not in a lifeboat, it's over. So there's sort of the where the grand clock is, right, where Jack and Rose meet and where they ultimately meet at the end. And there's the grand stairway with the dome, and the water comes crashing in through the dome. That's when you hear that instrument, and it's playing inside, and you basically see it tearing up the hallways, and you'll hear that instrument. It's a really, really great piece of soundtrack work, because of course in this case it's the two themes, like the ship theme and the sea theme, suddenly coming together in the moment where the ship has been overcome. And it's really the sort of thing that you never pick up. And I would argue to a certain extent, you are not intended to consciously pick up most of the time. It's something that adds to the, the power of the film. It's something that makes it an entertaining film to watch. And I think one of the reasons why someone would only really want to consciously pick up on them is if there's somebody who, if they're either a practitioner, if you want to get better at making films, it's important to understand how stuff like that works. Or if you, obviously if you want to like write a review, or if you want to engage deeper with the sorts of things that you tend to like, that's a really satisfying way of doing it. Another example for me would be Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is easily my favorite epic poem. And what's great about it is, so I think he starts off by talking about how he wanted to write something different, and then the poem changed. So there's the first change right there. And there's no very clearly defined end to each of the stories. I remember the first time I read it, and like I thought I was reading one story, and all of a sudden I'm into another one. And that's a characteristic of the story. It's kind of almost like this romp through all of the different ancient Greek myths and legends. And all of the different stories involve somebody changing into an animal, into a plant, and there's all sorts of different changes going on inside of it. But the poem itself is constantly shifting. The author in the invocation to the muse is talking about how he wanted to write one sort of a thing, and then all of a sudden he wound up writing a different one. And in fact, what's really interesting is that people say that there's the final change in... Actually, you know what? I think I've got the text nearby, so... So again, we've gone from creation all the way sort of like through the Odyssey and the Iliad. We've gone through the whole. We kind of go through everything. He's writing in the Roman Empire, so commonly the final transformation. No. If you saw my apartment, Gavinator, there's stacks of books like everywhere. So my copy of the Metamorphoses is probably about 1.5 meters away from my chair. I didn't even need to take off my headphones. But usually the last change is referred to as sort of this transformation of Julius Caesar into like a star or constellation. But these are the final lines of the poem. This is also what this poem is subversive as hell. But that's a conversation for another time. But here are the closing lines of Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is Charles Martin's translation. My work is finished now. No wrath of Jove, nor sword, nor fire, nor futurity is capable of laying waste to it. Let that day come then when it wishes to, which only has my body in its power, to put an end to my uncertain years. No matter, for in spirit I will be borne up to soar beyond distant stars, immortal in the name I leave behind. Wherever Roman governance extends over the subject nations of the world, my words will be upon people's lips. And if there is truth in poets' prophecies, then in my fame forever I will live. Right, Augustus Caesar, is emperor. You have the apotheosis of Julius Caesar, which by implication makes, Augustus a son of a god. And what does Ovid say? Well, when he dies, he will soar beyond the stars, the very thing that this exalted figure, quite literally the change that has happened before, Ovid's placing himself beyond that. And the final transformation has absolutely nothing to do with Caesar, except in the fact that the poet is surpassing him, and that it is in fact Ovid achieving immortality in his transformation in the poem. I think it's a hell of an ending. But the reason I bring up Ovid is because so much of Shakespeare's stuff is pulled out of this. Some of the stories that appear in the in his plays are directly pulled out of this work. And again, you can really enjoy, any of Shakespeare's plays without necessarily understanding the material that he's referring to. But to a certain extent, I think there is a tremendous enhancement to engaging with them if you kind of understand that context. So, like I said, I mean, again, to just bring it back to the topic, there can be a very alienating factor in, just, it's kind of like a bunch of sort of snobbish people who like read the New Yorker or something like that. It's like, oh yes, did you appreciate the image system inside of blah, 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 blah. And, sometimes that's just a bunch of wank. And I sometimes feel a little uneasy about that because it's, that I feel that can sometimes be very alienating for people. And I don't like that because I do like reading stuff and I like being able to share stuff I like. Copyright sort of forbids me from sharing all of the stuff that I like. Obviously Christmas Carol is nice because it's in the public domain. But you can, like the last thing that I would want would be a conversation like that to be something that turns people off of, of being able to read and enjoy literature, especially too, because you pick up on these things the more you read. The purpose of reading is not so that you can get all of the snobby bits, right? The purpose of reading is because it's it's enjoyable and it's fulfilling. And, as you read more, you enjoy more, and it becomes sort of this self-reinforcing thing. I was lucky enough that my music player broke when I was, not able to afford to replace one. So I had to read books. Otherwise I would have been bored out of my mind. Yes. I saw a tweet about that. And again, it could have been in public domain inside of Canada before, because our copyright is shorter than the US's, at least until I need to figure out exactly what happened with our latest trade agreements. But it was due to be extended under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then the US got out of it, and so it never applied. So it's obvious that we're willing to put that chip on the table when it comes to negotiating trade, and I don't necessarily think we're going to be better for it. But for the time being, I don't think we've done anything. Yeah, well, I mean, I'd love to do more Orwell, but I know that in principle, I should block anybody in the US from being able to see any videos of Orwell that I do, because it's very clear that is not in the public domain in the US, but it is for me. And the problem is that even though I want to speak to an audience, of like Canadians, people who I know, the nature of YouTube is such that they're almost certainly going to do a blanket, claim on it, even though they have absolutely no rights whatsoever to stop me from, recording and or performing, anything derived from Orwell's works. Ian Fleming, for that matter, too. Like in theory, you could do a Canadian James Bond, and I don't think anybody would be able to stop you. But of course, lots of luck getting someone to acknowledge your Bond film. Anyways, though, I don't want to make this longer than it has to be. As if you wouldn't call it Canadian James Bond. Well, I mean, I don't think there is actually a suggestion that James Bond is based off of someone in Camp X, which was based in Ontario. I don't believe that this character is actually who inspired the inspiration for James Bond, but there is actually a suggestion that the inspiration for James Bond was in fact a Canadian from Fleming's time at Camp X. Roald Dahl also was at Camp X, so like that's just an Assassin's Creed story waiting to happen. But yeah, last chance. Any comments? Any conversation? By the way, I really do appreciate all of you saying nice words about make Canadian James Bond and make it super campy. Well, the original Casino Royale starred Peter Sellers and was a parody. So there actually is a James Bond like that. It's just kind of not recognized as canon. And generally, if people are going to Google for Casino Royale, the movie, it's going to involve, Daniel Craig in a very small bathing suit, not Peter Sellers. um, but yeah, no, I did want to say thank you all to everyone. I actually also so like one thing I'll admit, Miss Ariella is wonderful, and I'm hoping this didn't come off wrong for everyone, but I'd stumbled, and when she said, "Can you even read?" that actually threw me a bit on the reading. So I kind of consciously had to stop looking at chat. And again, like that's just a me thing, right? That is not a reflection on Ariel at all. That is generally how we talk to each other, and it's totally fine. But I wanted to make sure that I gave enough time for everyone, especially because I wasn't able to sort of have those engagements and thank yous with everybody. So very enjoyable. Please do more readings. Thank you. Only comment. Oh, thank you, Olaf. Thank you for that. But yeah, no, I also want to make sure, because I think Ariella came in after I gave the introductions and all of that, so I don't know if she knew I wasn't going to be engaging with chat. So I definitely so yeah, well, all I wanted to say was the words of encouragement were actually really appreciated, just because, again, like if you're I went out knowing that I would stumble over sentences and that my stresses would be in the wrong spot. So it's easy for me to kind of get off kilter, and I don't ever want to be the person who will only listen to the good stuff. But it does kind of help my tendency to be overly critical on my stuff when people offer the counterbalance. So I appreciate that, simply because it makes me more inclined to doing that sort of stuff than my usual YouTube response before I played certain games is always like, "You suck, kill yourself, dude, LOL." And like, obviously I'm not gonna feel like I should continue doing that sort of stuff. So your family said I have an ASMR voice. Thank you. Soothing chalk. Okay, cool. Well, thank you all. And again, to everyone, whether we got a chance to say hi earlier, if I recall, it's Carl the Curious, Gavinator, Valiant Cheese, Olaf, Tiberiosity, Miss Ariella, Night Valian 28, Melee Rage. Am I missing anybody? I think that was everybody who chatted. Let me scroll up and just make sure. I think that was it. Also, for all of you who lurked inside of the chat, I really do appreciate you hanging out and showing some support, or just hanging out and hearing the story. If you didn't get a chance to hear it from the very beginning, I will be uploading this to YouTube, but I can also encourage you all to check out the book on Project Gutenberg, which is where I was reading it. Have a very Merry Christmas, all of you. God bless us, everyone. And I'll see you in the next one. Oh, sorry. Small announcement for those of you who watch my normal stuff. I may not do Stellaris on Monday. I completely forgot it's a Canadian holiday, and I can actually really use the time because I did this instead of recorded a new Oblivion episode. So Merry Christmas. Thank you all. Have a great evening. No hosts or anything like that tonight. I just got to get out of here.